So hello, everyone. Since today's guests deal with cross-cultural issues, I'd like to start with a sign in a Tokyo hotel, which is both mistranslated into English as well as exhibiting some interesting cross-cultural issues. And the sign says in very bad English, "It is forbidden to steal hotels, please. If you are not person to do such thing, is please to not read notice." So with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests. It's an unusual broadcast today in that we have two guests from the same company dealing with the same cultural issues, Mr. Chris Smit and Mr. Peter van der Lende. Chris is a managing partner of Culture Matters, a company showing clients the value of cultural diversity and how to maximize diverse talents for corporate growth. Having lived in the US, his native Netherlands, Belgium, and now currently living in Paris, he has worked with over 100 nationalities in 45 countries. He is a passionate and enthusiastic speaker with extensive experience in coaching and managing staff at all levels. His goal is to help clients gain cultural competence so they can work effectively with people with different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds. The rewards are increased time and money with a more focused management, effective production, and more humane HR policies. Peter van der Lende has his own company called Expand 360 and lives and works with Chris at Culture Matters. Peter has worked and lived in 9 countries in Europe, Latin America, and North America, and secures clients for his clients in these 3 markets. Fluent in English, Spanish, and Dutch, Netherlands-born Peter currently lives in Atlanta and has 20 years experience in market and business practice and market and business development. He builds bridges with what is practical with time and effort, persistent through face-to-face interactions, and patience to secure results based on trust and cultural competence. And both gentlemen met each other while working in Caracas for KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, and that's where they both started their careers. So welcome, gentlemen. Delighted that you're both with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So I'd like to start with a general cultural question, and then each of you can answer individually, of course, and add your own perspectives to it. Working with many nationalities can obviously create a lot of expectations as well as misunderstandings. How do you recommend creating a multinational corporate culture? Peter, why don't you go first, and then Chris?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I will hand it over to Chris fairly quickly. But I guess what a good intro is, and that refers to the famous triangle, Chris, that we always talk about that ends with respect, but it starts with awareness. And many companies, and that is of course people in companies, do not really realize that at the core of many problems there is a cultural component. It is many times it is blamed on a person or a personality. That person is not understanding me. That person is not putting enough effort in, etc., not knowing that a Mexican is different than an American, that a Chinese is not working like a Dutchman, etc. And so awareness, it starts with awareness. And the famous sentence I have used, and it has been used also in a specific article, is a bridge requires a gap. You cannot build a bridge if you don't even perceive that there is in fact a gap. So I will leave it at that, because I know that Chris has maybe more practical and also some references to the theoretical framework as such.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Peter. Just elaborating a little bit on what Peter started in terms of the pyramid, if you want. For us, it starts with indeed awareness, and awareness is the awareness of the fact that people actually have a culture of their own. because we are fish in our own bowl. We don't tend to see there's a ceiling and a floor, and we take it for granted. And that gives us limitations, because for us, it is really difficult to describe our own culture. Us being two Dutchmen, it's difficult. For you being American, it's difficult to describe typical American culture, whatever that may be.
Mhm.
The next thing is the next level in development, if you want, is understanding. Okay, so now we're talking about a Dutchman versus an American. What are those differences and how do they work? Then you've got, and this is something you can learn, right? It is something you can understand, you can learn. Then there's a level which is hard to cover, which is respect. Respect is not something you can learn. Respect is something that is an intrinsic something that you bring to the table when you do work internationally. And if you're able to cross that bridge, then the next level would indeed be cultural competence. What do you do? How do you behave yourself? Because in the end, it is about doing. So that's a bit of an elaboration of what Peter said. A little bit in addition to your question, then, Philip, is that how do you create a multicultural company? Well, first of all, it's really difficult because culture is something that's really complex, and it is like water in a way. If you try to scoop up water with your hand, it runs through your fingers. It's hard to hold, but it's definitely there. You can't deny it. And the second point is that if you talk about, in this example, a Dutch company or an American company, the dominant culture will always be, in this case, the Dutch culture, if it's hosted in the Netherlands, or the American company if it's hosted somewhere in the States. Because you fall under usually American HR practices and also U.S. law. Or U.S. state law. You cannot get away from that. Those are restrictions. And no matter how many Germans or Indians you bring in, that is not going to change anything. So the simple answer is it's really difficult.
Yeah, that the simple answer is that it is difficult. It's very true.
But it's doable. It's learnable. You can learn this.
Absolutely. One of you raised the issue of sort of distinct American culture, and I've done a lot of cultural training myself over the years. Sort of as an aside, when I describe the United States to immigrants, to foreigners, what unites Americans from different cultures, from different nationalities, are what I call the 3 I words: individualism, independence, and initiative. Mm-hmm. And those 3 characteristics are very American, and other cultures may share some, but not necessarily all together. And mm-hmm. Once an immigrant, or certainly the children of immigrants, adopt those 3 characteristics, perhaps, or 3 traits, again, individualism, independence, and initiative, then the person is much more American than foreign, or the host country, from the original country. And that's a problem, of course, for traditional, from parents from traditional cultures, where especially where individualism and initiative is not valued. So that creates cultural clashes within the family. Mm-hmm. So both of you started with KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, and Chris, you were mentioning that Dutch, or in this case, the Netherlands, would be the dominant culture in the company. But Dutch is not, of course, a world language. And since I assume most corporate communications and operations are done in British English, and each language brings its own assumptions and world outlook. So how does that change the mindset of executives and staff at KLM?
Well, again, I can start with the short answer, and my short answer in terms of how I have experienced the time that I spent in Caracas is that it doesn't change the mindset in the time, which is already some time back. But management of that area, management was Dutch, and management was influenced and got their briefs from the Netherlands. And in a practical sense, what tends to happen with pretty much every culture is that they switch back when they're among themselves, and they switch back to their own language, which the Dutch would do. When you're so-called entre nous among each other, then you will switch back to your native language. And plus, it also happens quite often that in this case, take Caracas in this example, that it happens quite often, or happened quite often, that the person working there, the non-Venezuelan working there, simply didn't speak any Spanish, and could only communicate in English. And the Venezuelan could better communicate in Spanish, but could manage in English, but certainly couldn't speak any Dutch. Peter, you spent more time than I did there. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, the language is a topic that is close to my heart, and it's a very, very interesting topic all by itself. I read books about it too. It's what's it called? Don't Believe a Word is one, and the other one is Through the Language Glass, I believe. And of course, it talks about how language influences culture and vice versa, and does it influence personalities, and does it shape thought and all these things. And it's a debate, I think, that will never end. But I think the most important thing is what Chris said. Does it really shape culture? It probably, in my opinion, also not necessarily does. It does impact, but where it impacts really is when the Dutch believe that communicating in English is absolutely necessary for international relationships. And that's not necessarily true across the board, across the world. It is an assumption that Americans have, and potentially the English, and also to an extent the Dutch have. So it is imposed on the Latin Americans. So you cannot work for KLM if you don't speak English. But then at the same time, we use language, and we have a Dutch culture that is also somewhat imposed on others, and it is of course expressed through language, and the Dutch directness is a part of that. So a Dutchman could say in Venezuela, I'm not impressed with how you manage this project, right? And I think we should definitely change something. So that is expressed through language, but it's really the Dutch culture at play here, which is absolutely shocking sometimes to foreigners, and how a Dutchman communicates in a foreign language, or in their own language for that matter. I would say, by the way, I just made a note here that there are always funny anecdotes related to language. But one of the things, Chris, you may remember as well, is we assume that English is the international language. But when KLM was trying to build an alliance, and even a company with Alitalia, the Italians, and Air France, that was not the case. In fact, it was French and it was Italian. They then had to change internally all sorts of communication and platforms to be able to communicate with the rest of the world. And now, of course, they're a Dutch alliance partner. So it's not a given, and it does impact the relationship quite a bit.
Can I add a little bit to that then, Philip, please, from my own experience? But it's a blueprint for what Peter has been doing. I'm a native Dutchman. I was born in Amsterdam. Now I live in Paris. My partner is born in what is now called the Russian Federation, but grew up in a country that was part of the Soviet Union, which is called Azerbaijan. So she speaks Russian. I speak Dutch, but we communicate in English. It's our only means of relevant communication. Peter, you're from the Netherlands, you live in the States, your wife is from Venezuela, she also doesn't live in her home country, and you also had to make amends in order to get the relevant communication going. So, but that doesn't take away my Dutchness, and I think, knowing you, Peter, how I know you is that doesn't take away your Dutchness either.
It doesn't, no.
Right.
I speak Spanish with my wife. We speak Spanish at home. I have 3 daughters. They're born in 3 different countries. We speak Spanish for the most part. I try to keep the Dutch up as well. It's difficult, but my Dutchness indeed doesn't go away. And my daughters make fun of it, and my wife has to deal with it, of course, as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I'm always impressed when I'll say a cold climate person marries a warm climate person. You know, a Swede marries a Spaniard or something, and I can imagine the fireworks in the family.
Absolutely.
But you do adapt, though, Philip. You do adapt in a way, because I'm here sitting alone now at home. My partner is stepped out to do some New Year's shopping, etc. And she said to me, as she's very polite in her general communication, say, do wish happy holidays to Peter. I haven't done that, Peter, yet. Okay, but she says if it's appropriate to wish him happy holidays or Merry Christmas. And I think to myself, if it's appropriate, that is not even a question. I will do it or I will not do it. And that is, I say yes, I nod yes, and I follow you adapt to some extent, but the communication that I have with my kids, for instance, is very different.
And Chris, what did she say? Happy holidays or Merry Christmas, or what did she say?
I think she said Merry Christmas, which is to that extent also interesting because being from Soviet Union descent, Christmas there is not on the 24th, 25th as we celebrate it. So I hope it's appropriate, Peter.
Yeah, that's where that appropriateness comes from, right? She is sensitive to it because Christmas, and even in the United States, depending on where you are or who you speak to, people would prefer to say Happy Holidays because you don't know if that person is Christian or celebrates Christmas, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Many years ago, my ex-wife and I attended an interfaith wedding, Jewish and Protestant, and I think it was the rabbi. There was a rabbi and a minister, and I think the rabbi said, "Some of you think it will be difficult to navigate an interfaith, an interfaith marriage. The fact is that any marriage between a man and a woman is an interfaith marriage." And I think that's even more true than the religious aspects of it.
True.
You've mentioned some of the cultural issues. What are the most difficult cultural difficulties that each of you has faced? Chris, why don't we start with you? And I mean this, professionally.
Okay, well, stepping outside of my personal role and putting on my culture matters hat is my experience over the last 20 years is that I'm generalizing here because culture is not written in concrete or fixed in stone, if that makes any sense. Is that for most Westerns, including Australians and say North America, or at least the US and Canada, what I have experienced is that the Japanese are the most difficult to work with. Then it's the Chinese, and then it becomes the Indians, and then it becomes gradually better a little bit, but not much. What for us Westerns, Dutchmen and Americans, is quite difficult because you cannot generalize over Europe as such as one culture. Is for us it's really difficult dealing with collectivistic cultures. Because for us, we look at somewhat like a black box. They say yes to everything, but then the yes is not always a yes. I was doing a workshop for a big Dutch firm, which was a multicultural organization. And this Indonesian woman told me a story that happened to her. She said, we were out having a beer, having a drink. And then one of the Dutchmen made a round, who wants another beer? And then she said to the Dutchman, she said, well, my glass is still half full, which is an indirect way of communicating, which is very appropriate in Indonesia. And then the Dutchman leaned over, that's not what I'm asking you. And so that's a very Dutch directness. I want to have to yes or no. Do you want another drink? And she very clearly said, no, I don't want another drink. But for the Dutchman, it went over his head like this. And so those are the things that we bump into. Vice versa, it happens the same. I'll give it to you in a moment, Peter. Is that for years I worked with a Japanese colleague who was married to a Dutchman, lived in the Netherlands for 400 years already. But she was so indirect with her communication. You always had to recheck and carefully recheck, is this what you're saying? Or are you saying this, but you mean something else? So that it's for both cultures, individualistic and collectivistic cultures, it's really difficult to find a common ground in terms of direct versus indirect communication. Peter?
Yeah.
Yes. Examples of what was the question? Examples of where
the most difficult cultural difficulties, the most difficult cultural situations that you've encountered.
Yeah, I think Chris hit it on already. I'm trying to think in terms of other dimensions, because Chris mentioned individualism and collectivism, or loyalty to self, what we like to call it. We have, and Chris has renamed some of the dimensions in the past, and I think he did a very good job doing that, because I think the new labels are better. One of them, for example, is instead of saying masculism or feminism, what is it's better to say
goal orientation.
Goal orientation, which is a very important one, because if you think about the United States and Netherlands, people might think that in the Netherlands the Dutch are very goal oriented, but for the Dutch it's very important how you get to that goal. So I call it the journey versus the destination sometimes. So the journey is as important, if not more important, than the destination itself, etc. But what I would like to shift to, and maybe we get to that later as well, is hierarchy and open communication and things like that. So when I was working in Latin America, of course, it's a very collectivistic area for the most part. So everything is in groups and family is important, etc. So just go out on your own and doing your own thing can be frowned upon. But it's the most important thing was like this yes culture in Mexico, for example, where I worked, and I was trying to get this open, direct communication going as a Dutchman, and I had a team there, and I was just hitting that wall all the time. Like, I'm encouraging you to speak up, and what shall we do? And the Mexicans were really looking at me like, you're not really a leader because you're asking us what to do, and you're asking us for an opinion. We just want you to tell us where we go from here. So they're basically staring at me like, what are you doing? And it took me quite a while to find the balance, because I cannot become Mexican overnight and they cannot become Dutch. So we have to find some sort of a balance. And I think over the years, it started to work really well. And I think hierarchy is another one that is really important. And hopefully, I think we will have time to get to that point too.
Yeah. So that does raise the very interesting questions, as you're saying, about hierarchy and management styles. That the United States has what is normally called an open communication style, where lower level managers and employees are normally encouraged, or certainly not discouraged, from expressing their opinions, their ideas, their suggestions about how to make the operations better, for example. And in most American companies, there's, I wouldn't call it necessarily an open door policy, but a way to easily communicate with senior managers, even potentially the boss, depending on how big the company is. The contrast is that most countries or most cultures, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, East Asia, and even in Europe, are very much top down. The manager decides, or the boss decides what to do, and the staff implements the boss's decisions. And there's very little communication, and it's often impossible for a low-level person to go beyond his boss's level to, have a suggestion or idea bubble up to the top. So again, these are very different management approaches, and what you were saying, Peter, is in Mexico, is very much like that. So how do you encourage people from top-down societies to give their input when their own culture discourages it?
Maybe I can just quickly start, Chris, and I am 100% sure that Chris will have some very solid observation on this very topic as well, because I think first we need to establish Well, let me take a step back. There's a slide that we use, and it has a person with a fish in his hands. And on the slide, it says fish discover water last. That's what it says, right, Chris? Meaning the fish is out of the water. Suddenly the fish realizes I'm out of my environment. I need that water. I didn't even know that I was living in water because now I'm out of the water. And I always have to think of that slide with the fish out of the water when I talk to people in general, but Americans in particular, about hierarchy. And in fact, Chris and I have some differences on this topic, or at least a different angle, or slightly different view on this. And that is that I'm a Dutchman, and I've lived and worked in 9 countries, including in the United States, and I find the United States relatively hierarchical. And that's because I'm a fish outside of the Netherlands, and I'm also not American. So I believe that I have a view on this that is different than an American who is in the United States. An American in the United States thinks that this is a very open society where opinions flow easily. But compared to the Netherlands, I can tell you that the Dutchman will tell his boss or her boss that he's dead wrong about something, and comes up with an alternative and say, if we do this, that's much better. That doesn't happen in the United States. In the United States, the boss has an idea that comes from that boss. Then the employee might say, well, what about alternative A or B? Fine, you can come up with alternatives, but the boss might say, no, I heard it from my boss, we better do it. In the Netherlands, the employee might say, I think it's a stupid idea. I think we shouldn't do this, and may rebel against it. And I don't think that will happen in the United States. So Europe is culturally extremely diverse. So in the Netherlands that might happen. In Italy, not necessarily. So that's the point I would like to make first and foremost about the fish out of the water, and how the United States is not necessarily seen as an open communication culture in the eyes of a Dutchman, but it is in the eyes of the Mexican. Chris?
Yeah, true. I agree with that. I'm just quickly glancing over our little cheat sheet, which if I hold it up, you won't see it anyway. So it's a bit useless to actually hold it up. But I'm going over some scores on one of the first primary dimensions of culture, to nuance the first statement in terms of you have the United States on one side, and then you have Europe, Latin America, and Asia, and they're all more top down. That's not necessarily true. A country in the Caribbean island, Jamaica, actually has a quite comparable level of hierarchy compared to the United States. So does Canada, by the way. So does New Zealand and Australia. So do the Dutch, the UK, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, all of them. They all have a relatively comparable score on hierarchy when it comes to the United States. Now, your question in the end was, okay, how do you go about this? In general, you could argue that for a person from a higher scoring country, say Belgium, Italy, France, going to a lower scoring country in terms of hierarchy, for those people, it's relatively easier to adapt. Excuse me. I'm still suffering from my cough. Once a Belgian told me that working in the Netherlands, and the score is significantly different between Belgium and the Netherlands, she told me, I experience about 50 degrees more freedom, whatever she meant with that, typically. So for the people that score from a lower scoring country, say the Germans, the British, and the Dutch, as an example, going to a country like Mexico or France, it is quite confusing. Why all this mess? You are just a boss. That's all you are. So that tends to be by far more difficult. Now, if you would like to get, as a Dutchman, say Peter in Caracas at the time, if you would like to get some feedback from the people who are, in this case, Venezuelan, what a solution could be is get the Venezuelans together and give them an assignment, as in, I would like to get some solution to this and this problem. Appoint one spokesperson, and this person will then feed that back to me. So there's no loss of face, there's no difference in hierarchy, it's a clear assignment, and it all makes sense. I want you to tell me what's going on. So that could be a way around it. There's no one way of organizing here. As Henry Mintzberg said already, but there are different ways to different roads that lead to Rome. So this might be a solution.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Thank you. And you're very right. And each company is its own culture in itself. And I worked for an American company where they said, we absolutely want your input. We value your input. And I think everyone there was American. There may have been one or two immigrants, but basically everyone was American. And this was in California, which supposedly is very open-minded. And the reality was that when I did give input, it was not valued, and they basically shut me down. So, so again, it very much depends on the corporate culture. But in general, as what you're saying, is right in terms of cultural hierarchies and so forth. And that leads to a question about stereotypes. Stereotypes, a lot of people think that stereotypes are wrong, and we shouldn't judge people by whatever the criteria are. The fact is, however, that when you meet someone for the first time, you may meet a person, he introduces him or herself, and you can tell by the person's name or accent or nationality in general, and where the person came from, and that creates a certain stereotype. The Dutch are this way, the Americans are that way, the Japanese are the other way. And stereotypes are stereotypes because there's an element of truth to them. There's an element of fact to them. So what are some of the general stereotypes that both of you have found about working with different nationalities? I'm talking about the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, the Americans, the British, and so forth. You can go down a list of nationalities. What do you generally find?
So you would like to hear stereotypes that we have found to have some sort of merit?
Yes.
Okay. Peter, you want to go first?
Well, the stereotyping, of course, of Latin Americans is that they are kind of easygoing and be late and enjoy life, and family's important, and all of these things. And so yes, the stereotypes, you apply them across the board. And yes, I mean, my first day in Venezuela, for example, when I was in Caracas, and the Venezuelan said, well, it's Friday, or actually it was a Thursday. On Thursday, every other week, we just go and roll out the cart with the beer and the whiskey, and we're going to have some fun. And we did, and we went out afterwards, and the Venezuelans drink whiskey. That's part of their culture, it is surprisingly. And so it was very late. I didn't even show up at the office the next day, and they said, "What happened to Peter?" Because I could not really handle the partying. And another stereotype is, I guess, the Mexicans just saying yes. I had multiple times when I suggested something, everybody was nodding about something, and it didn't happen. But the most important thing, and what I wanted to say here, is apart from the stereotyping and coming up with all these stereotypes. By the way, the Americans, I think the stereotype is just do it, and hopefully we have time to get to that, because the trial and error culture of the Americans is extremely important to understand. But what I would add to this stereotype topic is, stereotyping is not necessarily bad, I think, because there's some truth in it, right? Because otherwise, why would it be a stereotype? First, there are big differences between the Latin Americans too. So between the Venezuelans, very Caribbean styled culture, versus, for example, the Andes stereotype culture of Peru and Ecuador. Very different people, very different way of approaching things in terms of hierarchy and in terms of making noise and opinions, etc. It's very different. But the most important thing, I think, is like stereotyping is not bad, but you have to be aware of these assumptions,
right,
and don't assume or don't attach any competence or any skill level to it. And that's, I think, is a proven fact that if as soon as you make a stereotype, and including fluency of language, then suddenly the other person might attach an opinion regarding the skill, the professional skill of that person as well. So if a Venezuelan is loud and his English is not so good, maybe he's not so good in sales or marketing. That's, of course, absolutely wrong, right? I mean, that person could be much better in the job than you are, but you are assuming things based on that stereotyping and what you hear. I'll leave it at that, Chris.
Yeah, let's start with our own backyard then, Peter, the Netherlands. One of the stereotypes that is often mentioned, which I think is true, we are overly direct. I've been out of the country, out of the Netherlands for the last 16 years, and every time I go back, I am stunned by the rudeness. The really, I was in the supermarket. I had a question about something, and this woman looked at me and talked to me 3 words, and she turned around and just went to do something else, and I was flabbergasted. That's one of them. The understatements that the Brits tend to use, right? A Brit is sorry for everything. Sorry, I'm so sorry. They're not sorry. They're not sorry. They don't give a well, whatever. But they're not. But they have to say sorry, and they actually do say sorry. One more about the Dutch, by the way, which is I think is an interesting one and an important one as well, is that the Dutch have marketed their. We are very tolerant. The Dutch is a tolerant society. In terms of how liberty and what you can do and the soft drugs and all that good stuff. But the Dutch are not really tolerant. No, the Dutch fundamentally are indifferent. I don't care what you do, Philip, as long as you leave me alone. Okay, you do what you do and you leave me alone, it's a misconception. It's not really a stereotype. For the Indians, for instance, I have quite some experience in India, is the wobbly head. The shaking the head like this, and you never know is it a yes or is it a no. And the right way to say no in India is to actually say yes. And then you still don't know where you are as a Western. You come back to this collectivism, individualism. Yeah, I could go on and on and on and on and yeah, you've got enough experience. But what's that, Peter?
Maybe I can add to the English because I think it's a very good one. We use it quite a bit and I use it quite a bit as well. It is a famous quadrant that you can find on, if you Google it, it's what the Englishman says and what the Dutchman hears. And these are funny, very, very funny statements or very funny phrases. And in fact, I told everybody, to an extent, it applies to the American versus the Dutch as well. The Americans are a little bit more explicit than the English, but the American would also say, well, that's an interesting idea, meaning I don't like it very much. And what the Dutchman hears is, it is an interesting idea. So the Dutchman hears really what is being said and takes it that way. So if person, maybe you want to think about that, okay, we'll think about it. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, meaning I'm not really liking it, but the Dutchman takes the idea further in the company because that's what he heard. So these are differences that are very, very true, and it's a stereotype that the English are just going around it a little bit, trying to convey the message to them clearly that something shouldn't happen. But the Dutchman is already on the road doing it because that's what he heard.
Yeah.
I'm laughing because I've heard this from other guests as well. The Germans will say the Americans are very difficult to understand and very indirect. where Americans don't like to hurt other people's feelings. So if you do badly at a project, you would say, gee, I really think there's some ways that you can improve that. And, what do you think we could do about that? Where the German would simply say, that was terrible, you really screwed up, and, do it right the next time, or something like that, something very direct and what appears to be impolite to other people. So,
oh yeah, it's an endless book like this. You can
yes.
keep on talking about this.
There's another wonderful antidote that that a previous guest also said. He's German. He lives in California, and he went back to Germany and ordered something at a restaurant. It was something very simple, like let's say a hamburger and French fries, something like that. And instead of wanting French fries, he wanted a salad. And the waitress said no. He said, "What do you mean no? It's the exact, you've got both on the menu, you've got they're the exact same price, they're both sides. What do you mean no? Change one for the other." "No, we can't do that. Whatever is on the menu, that's what's on the menu, and that's it. And there's no changing." And he was so shocked, having lived in this country for many years, that you can't make substitutes and so forth. So yeah. To him, it was very funny as well.
Yeah.
I think, Peter, you had raised the issue of trial and error. That's something that Americans, one of the American management styles. Do you want to elaborate on that? And then Chris.
Yeah, this is a topic that comes up all the time, and it's actually a very practical thing to think about and to realize when you work across cultures and across borders, because you have to potentially execute a project together as a French and as an American, and the styles are very, very different. So to give you an example of the, I can describe the slide, Chris, but can't describe it, but I will give it a try. Is if you think about time and progress and all of that, and you have them on different scales, what an American typically does is just do it, right? But we need to do a step, we need to accomplish something, let's just start. And then it may fail. And if it fails, you plateau for a while and say, okay, that didn't work. And then you say, let's try something else. And then that fails, or there's something accomplished. Okay, something worked, and then you do it again. And so it's trial and error. It fails and it looks ugly, because the road towards the goal is you fall down and you get up. So it is ugly and bloody and messy and painful, etc. The Germans and the French don't like that very much. They prefer to engineer to perfection and then execute. So the road towards the goal is slow. So the American looks at the German and says, nothing is happening. Well, the German is at his desk engineering, doesn't want to fall on his nose and have blood everywhere. He just wants to make sure that it works. So it's slow. The American thinks there's nothing happening. These people are not doing anything. And at some point, the German says, I'm done. And it's actually pretty perfect, and then execute. So there's very little mess along the way. And he looks over to the American and says, what a mess. But at the end of the day, they more or less achieve the same thing, but in a very, very different way. So that is the trial and error. The Dutch, by the way, maybe Chris, you should take up that one so we can divide this funny topic into two.
Yeah, it's one of the clearest examples, I think, because pretty much all Anglo-Saxon countries have this so-called trial and error approach. Is in the US, there's an apparel company called Nike, which you probably have heard of. And they have a slogan. They've had the slogan for years. And what is their slogan? Their slogan is just do it. You don't have to think, you just do it. That's the first thing that you do. The other example is the UK, same concept in a way. Then I'll get to the Dutch. Same concept for the UK. The Brexiteers, the people that wanted to get out of the UK, out of the EU, that is, they were often asked, do you have a plan? You want out? Fair enough. But do you have a plan? What is going to come after that? And the answer was always, no, we just want out. And that's what happened. And now they're in this big mess still. of which we are suffering to some extent because some of the UK products or produce is not we can't get here continental Europe. The Dutch have a different approach to this. The Dutch can come together as a team and they can eventually decide, okay, we're going to launch this software version 1.0. Then we're going to launch that in 5 days' time. Everybody agrees? Everybody agrees. Next week, 4 days or 1 day before the launch, this team comes together again. And are we ready? Yes, but maybe we should wait until we have version 1.1 because then we have less of bug fixes and we can actually deliver a better product. So what the Dutch tend to do is they come to their conclusion with a phenomenon called growing insights. So as time progresses, I get more information, which changes the decision that I've made before that. While Anglo-Saxon will say, no, this is our launch date. We're gonna launch version 1.0, and we will do some upgrades, some service packs or something. Look at Microsoft. This is typically how they launch or how they have launched not so long ago. They're one of the latest products, which is called Teams, which in the beginning was absolutely inferior to a product which was already on the market. But now it's going slowly better. But this is just the history of Microsoft. That's how it's.
What's the name of that product you just mentioned?
Pardon?
What was the name of the Microsoft product you just mentioned?
Teams, MS Teams.
Teams, yes. TEAMS, yes.
Yeah, and for those of you who are old enough already and have a computer background, go back to 1997. Outlook was the first year that Outlook was launched, and many of us on Windows use Outlook. That was a program, it just didn't work. It was buggy, wasn't functional, and only later, a year later, they launched Outlook 98. That was a lot better, and now it's a really full-grown, very capable product, but it is trial and error.
Yeah. I have another example of that, by the way, and I was checking my systems here because I hear a ping of emails.
That's on my side. It's I'm sorry about that. I don't know how to stop it. It's
Okay.
a series of emails that are going out, and those they're coming under my name, so that's coming to my computer, and the pings are people who are out of the office.
Okay. Yeah, so the interesting, I find it very interesting what Chris just mentioned with Outlook. I use an example all the time, and I think it's striking because you have basically two big companies that produce airline jets, and one is American, which is Boeing,
yeah,
and one is European, which is Airbus. And about 20 years ago or so, Boeing decided to develop a lightweight carbon fiber airplane called Boeing 787, the Dreamliner. And it had two engines and it could fly long distances because it was lightweight, used less fuel, etc. Revolutionary. And Airbus was looking at it like, wait a minute, what is this? And they just were slow and like, we don't know what this is. And the Americans basically started to develop the Boeing 787 and basically shoot it up in the air as soon as possible, right? So this airplane is not even basically almost not done yet, but they want it up in the air, see what happens. And they did. So the airplane is flying, it doesn't look good yet, it's not perfect, there are issues. And at some point, it's like, keep on flying and keep on designing and keep on fixing and all of that stuff. And at some point, it's like, okay, we're going to sell this thing. And then there are clients and they bought it and then there were issues. So the airplane was grounded because there were all sorts of issues with the 787. Bring it back in, the whole fleet, stop, fix the problems, etc., etc. It took years and years for this thing to be actually completely reliable. At the same time, the Europeans were looking at it and said, we need to develop something too. It's the Airbus 350. They started designing. Don't shoot it up in the air yet. It's not perfect yet. And at some point, the Airbus 350 was done, and they start selling it. Very little issues. So it's a very good example of trial and error versus engineering at the other side.
Yeah, that's very true. the American approach, as you say, is trial and error. And we look at Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, as one of the great American success stories. But to get to the light bulb, I think there were 400 tries. I'm not sure, some astronomical number of times that he did it, and it failed. But one of the American cultural values is persistence. If you've got an idea, just keep at it and see if you can perfect it, and eventually, hopefully, it will work. So yes, it's trial and error in that way. But the other cultural issue is that Americans don't mind the failure, especially the IT industry, Silicon Valley. That it's in a way a badge of honor if you failed at a previous enterprise, because it means you've tried something, it didn't work, you've learned from it, and now how can you take that learning and apply it to something so that hopefully it will work? And there's a wonderful story that one of our previous guests told me. Do you know the story of 7-Up, the soft drink 7-Up? No? So the entrepreneur who had it couldn't quite get it to work. I don't know how you get a soft drink to work, but whatever it was, the taste wasn't right or something. And he tried, I think he tried 5 times, and eventually he was ready to give up, and he tried it a 6th, and it didn't quite work. And eventually he sold the company. And the person he sold it to, the entrepreneur, just tweaked it a little bit. That was the 7th try, and then it worked fine. So it was like constantly pursuing it until you get it right.
Yeah.
So if you fail, it's okay. In American culture, it's okay to fail because you're building to get something to perfection, to what it's.
And I think that the note in the margin and with to this extent, but pretty much all the questions you're asking us, Philip, is that there's nothing right or wrong about the Airbus didn't do it any better than Boeing did it.
Right.
Under certain circumstances, if your ship is sinking, then holding a meeting about this, how we're going to do this, is not really productive. And then jumping is probably better. It depends on the circumstances, on the context, which idea or which solution can be better than the other. So that's important to realize. The Germans are not better than the Americans. It is just different. That is what it is.
Exactly.
We joke about this quite a bit, Philip. So Chris is saying, like, let's have a meeting. We are very good at looking at our own culture as well, because we are out of our culture. We are the fish that realizes that there was water at some point out of the Netherlands. And what Chris is saying about the ship is sinking, let's have a meeting, is a very Dutch thing. So we make jokes about ourselves a lot. That the Dutch would say, like, okay, the ship is sinking. Let's go into the meeting room. How do we solve this? That's not a good idea. You better apply the American culture here and say, like, let's jump.
Let's jump.
For the Germans, it is the right procedure, because the Germans have thought of this beforehand, and they will just follow a procedure, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it swings all sides, but in the end, you get the people off the ship.
Yes, it's how you do it. That makes sense.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So another question about let's call them warring or hostile nationalities. If you've got a multinational corporation, and you've got two cultures that normally are fighting or are antagonistic. The Indians and the Pakistanis, or the Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese on one side and the Israelis on another, or it's currently the Ukrainians and the Russians and so forth. How do you bridge those gaps? How do you get people who normally, whose countries may be hostile to each other, to work together?
Shall I take that, Peter?
Yeah.
It's my first of all, it's what's important to realize when we talk about culture, at least when Culture Matters talks about culture and the definition of culture, is you talk about a group of people. So the one Ukrainian working with a Russian in the same company, you cannot talk about culture. You talk about individuals. That's important to realize. It's my personal experience in having done this, and I've coached, I don't know, enough people from Turkey, but Turkey has the Kurds, for instance, who are divided over Turkey, over Syria, over Iraq. Iran has the same division in terms of people that okay, they're Iranian by passport, but their native tongue is Azeri from Azerbaijan. I'm coaching people from Russia, from Moscow, that actually told me, you know, the reason I'm here is because I got an opportunity, but also I might be drafted if I stay in Russia. Then they meet a Turkish colleague or a Ukrainian colleague, and that's perfectly fine. On an individual level, I've hardly seen any struggles because of, oh, you are Ukrainian or you're Israeli and you're Palestinian. That means I'm not going to work with you. That is usually not how it works in an organizational level. What I have seen is this was again for a big Dutch medical company who were working on one project, and they had 3 locations, which was Boston, United States, India, and the Netherlands. And I went to these 3 locations, and I asked every group, would this go better if we would do it only in India or only in the Netherlands and only in the United States? And everybody said yes. So to that extent, leave it to me, and then it'll be fine. But if you put these people together, then it usually works. For me, I've never seen it as being a problem. Peter?
Yeah, the hostile environments, you can see it, of course, if you read the newspaper or you look at the news, or you look at sports, right? So if you have, for example, the World Cup is a good example. You have Iran versus the United States, or you have whatever, Germany against France, or whatever it was. You see this like this culture bubbling up, like, oh, all the stereotypes come out, and we want to beat them, and all of these things and emotions at the TV set and in the stadium, etc. And it's just almost like a fun component of sports in that sense. But when you talk about companies and you want to work across borders, what I've seen is that some of these stereotypes go away very, very quickly, because people who work across borders and meet other people within minutes normally realizes, this is just a very nice person. I need to get something done with this person, and I really like that person. And then it goes out of the window very, very quickly, that hostile stereotype, if you will, when people start to see each other in person and start to work with each other or have a drink together. It's a matter, in my mind, in my experience, it's a matter of minutes that flies out of the window.
And the World Cup football, it's not soccer, we call it football because we do it with our feet. There are a couple of these encounters between Morocco and France, and one of the star players from France is Kylian Mbappe, and he's friends in Paris Saint-Germain, which he plays here in Paris, and he has a good friend, a personal friend, who plays for the Moroccan team. Well, then you fight against each other, but you're still friends. Lionel Messi versus what was the other, for playing from Argentina, with the same Mbappe. They play in one team as well here in Paris. Both of them play in one team, but then you face each other. But that's a friendly competition in a way, even though there's a lot at stake. But nonetheless, as Peter says, on a personal level, it hardly ever goes wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful observation, and I've seen it also. I'm always amazed. We've got so many nationalities in the United States, just as in Europe, and we never have any flare-ups, say, between the Indians and the Pakistanis here. Just people work together, and it's fine. And on an individual level, it's fine. And a lot of Arabs hostile Arabs, let's say, meet Israelis, and it seems that they can all get along, even though their countries are not getting along. So it's very interesting in that way as well. In a similar subject about China and Taiwan, China is very, let's say, propagandistic about, I want to say it's superiority. thinking that it's, it's that its way is the best way or the only way or the most important way to do it. And whatever the Taiwanese want, that it's just that they're wrong because they should be incorporated back into China. And how do you get groups like that when there are these, I guess it's a similar issue, but it seems that with China and Taiwan, there's much more of the political overtones. And for example, if a Chinese student is studying abroad, whether it's in the United States, Europe, or South America, the Chinese government is still looking at the student, him or her, to make sure that he or she toes the party line, doesn't embarrass the homeland, and is more or less loyal. So when you've got that overlay of this propagandistic and authoritarian government, again, looking over say the immigrant to the foreign student, how do you then mesh the cultures to get them to work together? Is that clear?
Yeah, but I think this, again, the simple answer is you don't. You don't. They are comparable to some extent on one of those 4 dimensions that we mentioned earlier, one of those 4 primary cultural dimensions. There's quite a difference between China and Taiwan. Of course, China is a country of long-standing traditions, centuries of traditions, or tradition in general. And if you go back to 1945, the year that Taiwan separated from China and declared itself being an independent country,
so 1949. Sorry.
Okay, then I should change Wikipedia. Then over that period of time for the Chinese, that's nothing. That's a non-period. And since they're the bigger brother, they will just eventually, they don't want to allow that this happens. To that extent, the United States is not much different. The approach has been different, but what happened in Cuba, that was unacceptable. No way. What happened in Nicaragua was unacceptable. No way. The way the US exercises its influence is somewhat different from China. But those bigger countries, Big Brother, yeah, it's not watching you, but it's forcing you to go and steer this way. Yeah. Peter?
To conform, yes.
Yeah, I have very little knowledge and very little opinion about Taiwan and China, other than what I'm reading in the news. And from a cultural perspective, I think, Chris, you covered it. I think maybe what's interesting is going back to the previous topic, and it relates maybe to this topic, is the stereotyping about being hostile to each other, or historically have a hostile relationship. I said that it goes out of the window very quickly, and I'm talking about, working in a company, and an American meets an Iranian or something, or name any other country that are supposedly hostile to each other. It goes out of the window very quickly if you sit at the table drinking a coffee or having a beer after work. But there is always, under the surface, is something bubbling that may explode. And that goes back more to the larger group or nations who become hostile to each other. And that's what's one mentioned when Yugoslavia. I was in Budapest, Hungary at the time, and there were a lot of Serbians and Bosnians, etc., crossing the border, just escaping the conflict. And one of those guys said, "I don't know what happened, because we just were living together, and he was Bosnian, he was Serbian, he was a Croat, etc. And suddenly we were enemies." And he said, "I don't know what happened. We started to fight each other and kill each other." So it goes out of the window very quickly. But if there's something under the surface that's boiling, and somebody is, just and some gas comes out and somebody lits it up, bad things can happen. So I don't know about Taiwan and China specifically. I do not know enough about it.
Yeah, very interesting. And the example of Yugoslavia and the civil war among the 6 republics there, very, very interesting as well. It's a great example. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add before we close? Chris, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us on your show, radio or podcast and video. I hope it has been useful. Again, I want to emphasize that this cultural competence is something that you can learn. It's like swimming. It's something that you can learn. Learning another language, it's something you can learn. It's not a certain given that only these people can understand it. And I think, at least, and I think Peter will agree with me, that the determining factor in succeeding in business, in international business, is being able to understand different cultures and being able to compromise or go out of your comfort zone, do the stuff that you normally would not do, to accommodate the other person, just because it's easier. Who is easier to change? If it's between you and I, Philip. If I want things to be different, then it's easier for me to change me than for me to change you. So look at it inwardly from that, and I think in business, culture matters indeed. Peter?
Yeah, I would say that in international business, and Chris and I have been in international business for 20 plus years, and we've seen quite a few successes and failures when it comes to international business. In fact, we were in the midst of one that made us think twice about certain things, and I'm talking about KLM and Alitalia getting together, and we saw how things can fail, and we both believe that culture was at the very core of that failure when it comes to the Italian-Dutch alliance there, and it all starts with awareness. And what Chris also mentioned earlier is it's not only that you need to understand the other culture. Like I want to do business in the United States as a Danish company. I need to understand the Americans a little bit better. Well, it also starts with your own culture, because you are, whether you realize it or not, you're almost imposing to a certain extent your Danish approach onto the Americans, and you will come to the conclusion that things are failing at some point because you don't understand your own culture. And I'm specifically mentioning the Danish because we had recently had a conversation with a Danish company saying, like, there are certain differences that we don't understand. And for example, one was the HR approach, right? The Danish are saying, like, we have an HR approach, we need to get new people in, we need to keep them on board, etc. And the Americans were firing people or laying them off as they go. Like, we don't need that anymore, we need her anymore. And the Danish were just shocked. And so there was a friction there. So that's what Culture Matters does. We help companies, understand their own culture, understand the culture of the market they're getting into, to avoid some of these frictions to become bigger than they should be. So it all starts with awareness. It starts with the awareness of your own culture to begin with.
Thank you. Yes, you both mentioned two very interesting points. One is about introspection, and that's really critical. And a lot of individuals don't like to look at themselves. They try to blame others, and it's always external factors as opposed to what is something happening with me that I can change myself, or is something that I can do to make it better, and stop blaming the other people. And so the first criterion really is to be willing to be introspective, to be willing to look at yourself, to understand yourself and see if there's something that you can do to improve it. And I think, Chris, you said that cultural competence can be learned, and that's very true. And learning a language, by the way, is sometimes very difficult. It's like math or science. Not everyone is good at it in terms of the subject. So languages, I think, are much more difficult, but cultural competence is something that one can learn. And again, it's the willingness to do it, the willingness to be introspective, and the willingness just to apply it, and to see how you can bridge gaps and create a common purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So thank you both very much. This has been a wonderful talk with Chris Smit and Peter van der Lende, and appreciate very much speaking with you, and hope that everyone will join us next time for another episode of Global Gurus and Stories of International Business. And I've been your host, Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. Thank you.